Hello, everyone again. My name is Josh Taylor. I'm Traceability Manager at ISEAL, and it's an absolute pleasure to be welcoming you all to this ISEAL public webinar titled Chain of Custody, Building a Common Understanding and Enabling Corporate Action. We've got a bumper crop of content for you today, including an overview of the public consultation draft of the revised ISEAL Models and Definitions Guidance, in addition to a really interesting panel discussions with some very exciting panelists to delve into the real impact potential and the different pathways that chain of custody is allowing in terms of sustainability. Just before we continue, just to acknowledge appreciation and support from Walmart Foundation, who are supporting our work on chain of custody at ISEAL this year and into next. So with that, I'll pass to my colleague Jess, who will take us through the housekeeping and agenda. Over to you, Jess.
Thanks, Josh. Okay. It's great to see so many of you online today. I'm Jess, I also work at ISEAL, and I'm just going to take us through some housekeeping notes before we get started. So this webinar is being recorded and we'll be sharing it with participants in the upcoming days. Most likely this will be next week. And if you have any questions for ISEAL or for our guest speakers, please use the Q&A function. And if you're experiencing any tech issues, we've got Natalia on hand to help in the chat. So make sure that you post any technical issues in the chat box. And also keep an eye on the chat as we go through the presentation for any useful ISEAL links. And so on the agenda for today, we're going to kick things off with a brief introduction to ISEAL and chain of custody. This will be followed by an overview of the chain of custody guidance revision process and content that we've got. And then we'll be inviting our lovely panelists to join us for some discussion. And this will be followed by some Q&A, where we'll speak to questions from the audience. I'm not sure how many we'll have time for, but we're going to try and fit in as many as possible. So make sure you're using the Q&A box to add your questions. And so what is ISEAL? In case you haven't come across ISEAL before, or if you just want a reminder, I'm going to start with a brief introduction. So we see ourselves as having two main roles. One is that we're the global reference on good practice for credible and sustainability systems. And we have two flagship resources that I'll go into a bit more detail on the next slide. So these include the ISEAL Code of Good Practice for Sustainability Systems and also the ISEAL Credibility Principles. And so the second role that we have is that we're a membership organization convening a membership of 49 community members. And our members are ambitious, collaborative, and transparent sustainability systems from a wide range of sectors. And all of these sustainability systems have a shared commitment to making a real difference. And so we're going to pop a link in the chat also in case you want to take a look at who our members are. For a little bit more detail, I'm going to go into the resources that I mentioned on the previous slide. So we're a recognized and trusted thought leader on credible practices and the use of credible schemes. The ISEAL credibility principles that I mentioned help with defining the core values of credible and effective sustainability systems, and there are 10 of these. Then we also have the ISEAL Code of Good Practice for Sustainability Systems, and it's a global recognized framework that defines practices for effective and credible sustainability systems. And so the code basically puts the credibility principles into practice. And there's a wide range of organizations that use and reference these tools, such as sustainability systems, including standards, but also businesses, policymakers and governments, and then also technical experts. So I'm now going to hand back over to Josh.
Thank you, Jess. So the topic of today's webinar is on chain of custody, and I'll just give a brief overview of why chain of custody is important in the context of sustainability systems before jumping into content on the guidance. So chain of custody, it's a key system component for many voluntary sustainability schemes. It enables the transfer and the validation of information associated with the products, processes, businesses, or services covered by a sustainability system. Chain of custody controls the movement, handling, and processing of materials, both within and between approved or certified business entities. It forms the basis for any claims that can be made about an approved or certified product. And ultimately, chain of custody acts as the link between producers and consumers, and also between business entities within the supply chain. So it's important to note that there are a range of chain of custody models, and that each industry and each sector is different, meaning that the requirements of the chain of custody standards used, supporting systems used in those industries will vary as a result. So when we're discussing and when we're applying different chain of custody models, it's important to have a consistent shared reference. And that's why in 2016, ISEAL published the original ISEAL chain of custody models and definitions guidance document. So since 2016, the chain of custody landscape has changed, and it's changed dramatically. And we identify three real drivers for this. The first is the emergence of digital traceability systems, which are increasingly merging the domain and language of chain of custody and supply chain traceability. The second big driver for the change in the landscape is that companies are increasingly asking how different chain of custody models offered through sustainability systems support their ever-growing regulatory compliance obligations. And this has implications for the value proposition for different chain of custody models and is prompting real innovation and adaptation in how chain of custody systems operate today. And the third key driver is around corporate climate action. Corporate climate action is accelerating, and the next big hurdle now is around Scope 3 and emissions associated with supply chains. And those working in Scope 3 and those working in GHG accounting are looking to chain of custody systems to support the required information transfer through supply chains and also to channel incentives to drive further decarbonization. So as a result, we've now embarked on a revision process. And just in terms of the scope of the revision, we are updating definitions and key features of segregated, of mixed, and book and claim models to reflect this evolving landscape that I described. We've also introduced a new model into the guidance, which wasn't there previously, called controlled mass balance, and we'll be having a discussion about this topic, among others, later in this webinar. We've also looked to try to reconcile the different ways that chain of custody is used, the language used around it by different corporate entities for different uses and purposes, and that's including reconciling some of the language that's used for traceability, for due diligence, and for Scope 3 and GHG accounting. And just to note that this is part of a much broader suite of updates linked to the introduction of the revised ISEAL Code of Good Practice. And look forward to next year, where we'll be updating our sustainability claims good practice guidance. So if we move to the next slide, thank you. So just in terms of the revision process, it started earlier this year with a discovery phase where we both engaged with sustainability systems and those that use them to really understand some of the evolving evolutions that are happening within these systems. We formed a chain of custody working group who are advising us and providing inputs as we draft and we revise the guidance. And now we're into the public consultation stage. So the consultation was launched on the 11th of November, 2024, and it's going to run until 11th of January, 2025. And we thoroughly encourage everyone who's on this webinar to really participate in this consultation. And following the consultation, we anticipate publishing the revised guidance in March 2025 next year. So if we go to the next slide. Brilliant. So before we get into an overview of the content of the guidance that we've developed, first we'd like to start with a Menti to really understand from you all and to get your perspectives on where you think guidance is needed on chain of custody. So to participate in this, you can either scan the QR code that's on screen, or you can join menti.com using the code that Natalia posted in chat. So this should generate a word cloud, and I'm very interested to see where you think guidance is needed on chain of custody in this evolving landscape. So we'll wait just a minute or two to see your responses come in. And we have our first response in, impact, methodology. Yes, there is a need for guidance. That's good to hear. That's what we're here for. Brilliant. And we start to see already just some of the diverse applications of chain of custody coming into the chat, coming into the Miro. or meant to, sorry. So we can see due diligence as being front and center. We can see product footprint, which is related to emissions accounting. We can see carbon removals, again, related to GHG emissions. We see controlled mass balance, a model that we'll be diving into more at the, as part of this presentation. Accountability, outsourcing, resilience, improved mass balance, claims, very important. Brilliant. And we start to see already some key themes coming through. So we've got due diligence again, front and center. We've got claims really being up there. And it makes sense that chain of custody really underpins the ability for corporate actors to make claims about their products. So it makes total sense. Reporting, there's a whole wave. I was at an event yesterday and they described it as a regulatory tsunami of requirements coming in around corporate reporting. And certainly chain of custody is a means of which pulling this information through the supply chain to support corporate reporting. Traceability, EUDR, brilliant. So I think this is a great example of just how diverse the applications of chain of custody are, and why it's really important that we're all speaking in the same language as we're using chain of custody terminology and descriptions. And particularly as we look to leverage the chain of custody systems that are already out there for different purposes. So I can see that we've still got input coming in. Mindful of time, we might move on to the next section of the presentation, which is an overview of the revised consultation draft. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to give you very much a whistle-stop tour of some of the content that we've included in the guidance. It doesn't cover all of it. Again, I would thoroughly encourage all of you to look at the consultation draft, to participate in the consultation, because there's a lot of rich content in there. So when you go into it, when you look at the guidance, what you'll see is first that we've added a whole new section into the guidance, which goes into quite a lot of detail and description on key concepts that underpin credible chain of custody systems. And these concepts that we've included include chain of custody system boundaries and attribute transfer in mixed Series C systems. And I'll be given just an overview of those two concepts in particular kind of in the next couple of slides. We've also expanded our section on different chain of custody models, recognizing again that there's this evolution in the landscape and that we see new and innovative adaptations emerging, particularly as we have more and better traceability in supply chains. So the new models that we've added, they're not necessarily new in the landscape, but they're new to the guidance, include controlled blending and controlled mass balance. And that's in addition to those models that were already included in the 2016 guidance: identity preservation, segregation, mass balance, and book and claim. So it's important to note that within this guidance, we're focused on describing elements that are relevant across chain of custody systems. So each system, each supply chain, each commodity is different. And what we've described in the document really reflects common practice across some of these different industries, rather than good or best practice, which will ultimately depend on the context in which the COC is being applied. So to highlight some of the key terms and definitions that we've used in the consultation draft, we'll start with going back to basics, which is a new and revised definition of chain of custody. So in the guidance, we've defined chain of custody as a means by which inputs, outputs, and associated attributes are transferred, monitored, and controlled as they move forward through each step in the supply chain. And as part of the revision process, we've looked where possible to align our terminology to other frameworks out there, including ISO 22095. So it's important to acknowledge that within this definition, you can have chain of custody within an organization where you have the control of material inputs and how they're used to generate outputs, and the attributes and the information and data that's transferred across from inputs to outputs. And you can also have chain of custody between supply chain organizations. And a chain of custody system involves both chain of custody within an organization and between organizations to facilitate the transfer of sustainability information and claims. If we go to the next slide. Brilliant, thank you. So it's, as many of you are aware, I'm sure, there are a number of different chain of custody models that are used in sustainability systems and within supply chains. And these different models are different approaches to controlling inputs and outputs, and the transfer of specified characteristics within the chain of custody system. Now, I've used the term specified characteristics rather than certified volumes here. We define specified characteristics within the guidance as a set of production, material, and product characteristics that the chain of custody is designed to maintain. So that could most certainly include certified volumes, but it could also include other attributes or information, such as the origin of the product, or alternatively, emissions or sustainability attributes associated with production, which are then transferred through the supply chain. Final piece on this slide is that all of the chain of custody and the system and the models, they're all happening and controlled within a given system boundary. And the system boundaries are the parameters in which the transfer of inputs, outputs, and specified characteristics are controlled. So to make that feel a bit more tangible, on this next slide, you can see three of the factors and three of the considerations that we've identified as being really critical for thinking about chain of custody system boundaries. The first of these are the spatial boundaries in which the transfer of attributes from inputs to outputs are controlled. And within chain of custody systems, we see a range of different spatial boundaries, from tracking the transfer of attributes between inputs and outputs at batch level, at a manufacturing process point, through to controlling them at site level. And we also see, for some models, particularly those involving mass balance, spatial boundaries that can accommodate multiple sites within a company structure, so that is multi-site, and even chain of custody spatial boundaries that can accommodate multiple companies that are owned by separate legal entities, and that's group level. The next factor that's important to consider when we're thinking about these system boundaries are temporal boundaries. That means there's a time dimension to how the transfer of attributes from inputs to outputs are controlled. For some models, it makes sense and it's logical that you would have the transfer of attributes to outputs only after you've received corresponding inputs. In other models, such as mass balance, they allow a volume reconciliation period whereby you can have a transfer of attributes to outputs prior to receiving associated inputs, providing that the volumes and the attributes are balanced out over a given time period. And that's a term that's referred to as volume reconciliation period. The final set of factors that inform the chain of custody system boundaries are product groups. And this is really how granular we go in the tracking of products through supply chains. So product groups represent different products that are produced as part of manufacturing processes. And depending on the granularity of the groups that are used by the chain of custody system, you get more granular levels of tracking through the supply chain as a result. So if we move to the next slide, brilliant. So the next part of theory and of content that we've included relates to attribute transfer. And this is attribute transfer in mixed chain of custody systems. So mixed COC systems are models that allow for the mixing and or substitution of materials with a set of characteristics with materials without that set of specified characteristics. And the models in our guidance that allow mixing are controlled blending and all of the different variations of mass balance. And there's two factors here that determine how the attributes and how characteristics are transferred within mixed COC systems. The first is their approach to attribution, which is how characteristics are assigned to material outputs within a given product group. And the second is allocation, how we split these characteristics between multiple co-products that are produced during a manufacturing process. So for example, when soybeans are crushed, the resulting outputs are soy meal and also you have soya oil. If the transfer the approach to allocation is proportional, then you'd have characteristics being attributed to both the oil and also to the meal. And if it was free, then you could have a consolidation of these attributes to one of the co-products. And likewise, if there is mixing of certified, say, cotton and non-certified cotton in a spinning mill, just go for another example here, you could either have proportional attribution, where the resulting yarn that's produced at the spinning mill has a percentage blend, that's controlled blending, or you can have a certain volume of yarn that's produced that carries the specified characteristics. These concepts are particularly important when we're thinking about the role of chain of custody in contributing towards emissions accounting and reporting. So I will be wrapping up shortly, but before I do, just on one of the models that we've introduced into the guidance, which is the model controlled mass balance. Now, this is also known as controlled mix, and we'll be hearing more about this from some of our panelists. But the controlled mass balance model is a variation of mass balance where the physical material that's associated with the mass balance output, it meets minimum defined performance, data, and verification requirements. So on the screen, you can see that you have mass balancing happening within a compliant stream of material, but your non-compliant material is not mixed and does not enter into the mass balance supply or the mass balance stream. And this is a model that's emerged particularly in response to some of the regulation that we see that's mandating further control on all material that's entering into the supply chain, not just the certified proportion. So in the context of EUDR, what a controlled mass balance or controlled mixed mass balance approach could look like is that you would, the model would control for the performance of the material. So any material entering into the mass balance supply, whether certified or non-certified, would need to meet requirements around being deforestation free and legally produced. From a data perspective, the materials that are entering in would need to have records relating to the country of production, the area of production, geolocation, time range, and species, if applicable, in line with the requirements of the regulation. And from a verification perspective, operators would be obliged to conduct due diligence and to verify materials being negligible or of no risk. And this is a model that can be applied within the EUDR context, but it could also be applied in response to a lot of the emerging regulation that's coming in that isn't just focused on deforestation, that isn't just focused on the legality of production, but is looking at other and broader sustainability issues and risks within supply chains, such as forced labor and other kind of land use change as well. So just again to plug our public consultation, if you think what I said makes sense, I'd love to hear it. Even more so if you want to challenge us on any of the content that was shared, this is your opportunity to. The public consultation will run from the 11th of November through to the 11th of January next year. You can find the consultation draft, feedback, survey, and template for submitting comments on the ISIL webpage that was posted in chat. And yes, we look forward to receiving your input. So if we go to the next slide, perfect, thank you. So I've shared some of the theory behind chain of custody and why we're revising this guidance. Now it's an opportunity to take a step back and say, well, so what? Why is chain of custody important from a sustainability perspective? What's the role of different chain of custody models in supporting corporate sustainability action and helping also at the same time companies meet their growing compliance responsibilities? So to do this, we've got an excellent panel to delve into some of the complexities of this topic. Joining us today are Ruth Nussbaum, who is the Executive Director of both Global and Europe of Proforest. We also are very privileged to have Anna Laura Andriana joining us, who's Technical Unit Manager at the Roundtable on Responsible Soy. And then also finally, Jean-André Bonardel, who is the Global Supply Chain Lead at Qantas. So in terms of the format of this next part of the session, we've invited each of the panelists to open with a few slides to kickstart the discussion, after which we'll drop the slides and be a bit less formal and go into a discussion and, as Jess said, look to make time for questions and answers at the end. So Ruth, the floor is yours to go a bit deeper into the topic of controlled mixed mass balance. Thank you.
Thanks, Josh, and hi everyone. It's great to be here and really to be a part of a really important discussion. And the first thing I wanted to start with is, Proforest, as many of you will know, is coming up to 25 years. So we've been working in this sector for 25 years, and certification has been a really central part of what we've done over the whole of that time, and will continue to be one of the most important tools for achieving positive change, I think, going forward for many years to come. And because of that, discussions on chain of custody are not new. My own first introduction to long meetings in dark rooms about chain of custody was in the late 1990s. And so we have a lot of experience. And one of the things that I think is really important is that we look at that experience and really bring that to bear on the discussions we're having now about where ICO should be taking us with chain of custody. And one of the things that for me is the most important and we should really be thinking about is what are we trying to achieve with chain of custody? As all of you know, we very quickly get bogged down in detail. Josh just gave an excellent presentation, but there was lots of language there that's very dry. It's about characteristics and detail. But we need to step back as well and say, what is it that we are really trying to achieve? And I think what we're trying to achieve is real impact that transforms the sectors that we work with, that brings them to sustainability across the board. Impact which is just and equitable and keeps people, small producers, small businesses in the system, and also effective use of resources, which increasingly always feel very limited. So if we move on to the next slide, I really want to build on what Josh was talking about with this idea of controlled mix mass balance or controlled mass balance. So I'm assuming that everybody on this call, if you're interested in chain of custody, knows that we have these two main approaches to physical chain of custody. We have segregated, and then we have kind of mixes, mass balance, certification. And I think for the last 20 years, there has been a general assumption that moving from mass balance to segregated is the way to become better, more credible, to move forward. But I think that what we've realized over the last 10, 15 years is that may not be right, and we really need to rethink what we want to do if we want to drive impact. So if you just click down, when we look at what do different models achieve, if we really think about the impact on the ground, how do we change production? That either model does the same. You have to have the same amount of certified material going into the model in order to have either segregated or mass balance, particularly site-based mass balance, where it would come from the same place. In terms of costs of manufacturing, I think it's very clear that segregation has lots of costs, which around pipe work and those kind of physical segregation, which doesn't contribute particularly to sustainability. Where segregated has always been felt to be much more powerful is in terms of credibility and claims. And when we saw the word cloud earlier, lots of people obviously putting in things like claims and credibility. So for consumers, it feels much more credible to say the full physical volume I have really came from a certified source. But there are two, or possibly more, but two very clear unintended consequences of moving to segregated. One is, I think now really well recognized, particularly with the EUDR, is exclusion of smallholders. We all know across certification, it's much harder to certify smallholders, tends to give an advantage to the big players. But that's not what I want to talk about so much now. What I really want to talk about is the second unintended consequence, and that's leakage. What we are seeing more and more is that what segregation allows is that we segregate, we put in the physical infrastructure to segregate. It doesn't have any impact on the uncertified volumes. They stay just the way they were. But the people buying the segregated volumes no longer feel responsible. We are able to say, oh, no, I'm okay. And the rest of it goes somewhere else, to markets that don't care, or often to markets that can't afford to pay premiums. So if we go to the next slide, what we are seeing more and more with certification, and those of us that have been using certification as a kind of tool to achieve better production of agricultural and forest commodities, is what we're kind of calling the 2080 challenge. It's not the same for every sector, but more or less what we see is that certification begins to grow, and it grows up to about 20% of a sector, but it's very hard to go much further, maybe 25, but a big chunk, 75, 80%, continues to be conventional. So what we are seeing, that certification defines the ambition for the sector. It delivers best practice in certified areas, but it has limited coverage. And if we really want transformation, if we really want to address the massive issues around climate change, deforestation, social issues, we need to go beyond just that top 20%. And what we have seen through regulation, through things like the FLEGT process, is that incremental improvements to business as usual across the whole sector also result in very significant cumulative impact. And so just if you click once more, with controlled mixed mass balance, as Josh just introduced, the idea is that you continue to have your certified volumes, but the mix that you put in there also has to have basic requirements. I think you described it as minimum defined performance data and verification requirements, Josh. And of course, it's not new. FSC has been doing controlled wood for many years, and RTRS is going to talk, I think, straight after me about what they are introducing. And as Josh said, both ISEAL and AFI are starting to really get input on how to do this really well. But if we can find ways to do this instead of moving to segregation, if we can re-examine segregation and ask ourselves whether it's more about making us feel good as consumers or driving positive change on the ground, and whether controlled mixed mass balance might not be a better option for the latter, then we can begin to help address through certification that 80%. It's much easier to include smallholders as well, of course, and you don't have the costs of physical segregation. And just to finish, I saw there was already a question in the chat about how do we do this in practice? And I think there is already lots of learning from individual companies trying to do this, from sectors trying to do this, as I said, from certifiers trying to do this, but definitely something we need to learn about together. So Josh, back over to you, but just a kind of trying to frame why this feels for us so important.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ruth, for that excellent framing and a great introduction to just how different chain of custody models can drive impact and change in different ways, and the opportunities of emerging models like controlled mass balance or controlled mixed mass balance. I think you can tell from the audience that there's, we still need to land on a name that umbrellas all of the different approaches that could fall into this, how they can drive sustainability improvements in both certified and non-certified supply chains. And to the point you made, Ruth, about the need to more guidance and more examples, this is certainly something that we'll be working on next year. And so, as you said, there are already great examples of how to implement this at scale. So we'll be looking to draw on these examples as well as shaping, I guess, new guidance and new thinking on the topic. So our next speaker is Anna Laura. Anna, RTRS offers a range of chain of custody models. You're introducing a new optional model in response to regulatory change. The floor is yours to share more.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for attending. It's a pleasure always to be invited to these discussions. So yes, I guess many of you already know that we've been working for a very long time in RTRS to find a way to help companies address all the requirements of EUDR. But honestly, everything related to mass balance and deforestation-free supply chains has been part of the discussion for a very long time. And we've been receiving questions about what is within the mass balance mixed with the RTRS volumes for a very long time, even a lot before EUDR arrived. So that was, I would say, the initiation of this process. Then, of course, came EUDR asking for a segregation of deforestation-free and legally compliant volumes, not specifically recognizing certification as a tool. So we had to think and brainstorm and discuss with our stakeholders how we could do this. And then after several rounds of consultations, interviews, and different stages of the process, we came out with this new model where we have two different streamlines, I would say. One is, again, the typical solution, segregated RTRS volumes, where all the volumes, of course, are certified. They all comply with the due diligence EUDR requirements, and they are segregated. But we need to also be super clear and transparent with the volumes that are available and with the reality of what EUDR requires and the difficulties of asking stakeholders to create another supply chain, right? Like a segregation out of a segregation, it would be too much. So that's why we thought of this alternative. We called it EUDR RTRS mix, but it's basically this concept of controlled mass balance, where part of the volume is certified and another part, but every part of the volume, all the volume is compliant or aligned with the EUDR due diligence requirements, right? And this is not yet approved by our stakeholders, our members, but it's part of the new version of the chain of custody standard that is currently sent for members' approval. So we hope we can have this model working and being tested and piloted next year. Still have a little bit more time to get used to EUDR reality. So hopefully this will be available. Then if we go to the next slide, well, I don't know how much you know about RTRS, all of you attendees, but RTRS uptake is mostly linked to credits, not only physical volumes. And we still think that there is a lot of value on the role of the credits, not only because there are no intermediates and the incentives go directly to the producers, not only also because of the some regions and areas that are not necessarily exporting the physical soy to the main market that is now concerned, that is today concerned on sustainability, that is Europe, but also because the market wants also to continue focusing on sustainability beyond legal requirements. And so we consider this like a very complementary tool to regulatory to the regulatory world that we're living in. So the credit system will continue to accompany those stakeholders that are looking for compliance with legality and with regulations. So we have this hybrid solution where some of the volumes will be physical, but also combined with the credit system. We have one more slide to also share a little bit of this. So yes, as I was saying, the incentives with the credit system go directly to the producers, and that makes a real change on the ground. It can be connected also to regional development. It's also also a very important system to not defocus the importance on the change in the ground, right? Because all these focus on the physical flows could provoke a defocus of what we are really intending to do, right? Like a change in the way of producing, a real change in the farming system. And we need to continue focusing on that and putting efforts on that. And then again, it's also a super interesting mechanism to continue engaging with high-risk areas and specific corridors that are very important for the sourcing and the export to Europe. So it's crucial to continue thinking of what happens beyond legality and to continue putting efforts to keep on changing the way that we produce. With that, I give you again the floor, Josh. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ana Laura. Excellent presentation as always. And I kind of really appreciated you sharing how RTRS is navigating between this kind of space of voluntary sustainability action and then the need also of stakeholders' growing need around corporate legal obligations, and also highlighting at the end this importance of incentives as a driver of change. I think we shouldn't forget that we need to drive change on the ground. We can't just demand things. We also need to look at how we can structure pathways for sustainability. So this leads us nicely to our final panelist, Jean-André Bernardel. So Jean-André, Qantas work with corporate clients to implement science-based strategies that drive decarbonization within their value chains and account for it. Companies are turning to chain of custody as a means of enabling this information transfer and also for channeling incentives that support decarbonization efforts. So the floor is yours to share more on trends that you're seeing in your space.
Yes, thank you, Josh, and thank you for having me today. And hello, everyone. Maybe before trying to address your question, I should maybe highlight that this topic of transferring GHG emission within the value chain, it's a relatively new topic, but it's evolving fairly rapidly, and it has become a top priority for a number of companies that are now committed to decarbonize their value chain and address their Scope 3 emissions. So until fairly recently, trading carbon credits on the voluntary carbon market was pretty much the only options to transfer reduced emissions. But now we see emerging a number of new solutions, creative models to offer alternative approaches. So I'll try to illustrate in this context how chain of custody models and systems can also be applied to this GHG accounting space. So when we consider value chain decarbonization strategies, there are two questions that need to be addressed. The first question is really how to quantify the impact of an intervention or project in the value chain. And the second question is how to transfer this impact and share the benefits in between stakeholders. So for addressing the first question, the quantification question, we need a GHG measurement systems. And in the carbon greenhouse gas emission space, we would usually refer to MRV for measurement, reporting, verification frameworks to quantify reductions. Then to transfer those reduced emissions, we need a GHG transfer system. And that system is needed to assign emission reductions to different reporting companies within the value chain. And these systems must guarantee that there is no double counting, and it must mitigate the risk of seeing volume inflation of those attributes in the value chain. And this is where chain of custody can play a key role. And in fact, the ISIL chain of custody standards, they've been referenced in the latest publication from the GHG protocol. So it underlines their relevance and their importance in this context. So if we move forward, we can see now maybe the benefit of implementing such chain of custody system in this context of value chain decarbonization. So we have a very simplified value chain on the screen now, and we see how chain of custody system may allow to transfer the reduced emissions that are associated with the production of raw materials on the left of the screen throughout the value chain, and how in turn those chain of custody models would allow some companies that are using those materials, those decarbonized materials, to produce semi-finished product or finished product, and benefit from the reduced emission. However, there's a need for these companies to ensure a physical connection in between the decarbonized raw materials and the company's products. And the reason for it is because under the current standards, market-based mechanism, so a reporting mechanism where the physical flow and the and mean flow of the attributes would be decoupled. Those market-based mechanisms, they are not accepted for Scope 3 reporting purposes. So there's a need to have a physical relationship that can be ensured through a chain of custody system. However, and we can maybe move to the next slide, we don't have yet the list of the accepted chain of custody models accepted by GHG protocol to address that notion of Scope 3 traceability requirement. So the forthcoming guidance on the topic are expected for the first trimester of 2025. So we don't have so long to wait anymore, but the current understanding and the current expectations based on ongoing discussion is that to ensure that traceability requirement to a farm or land management unit in GHG accounting or a system of farm, a sourcing region, the expectation is that a range of chain of custody models will be accepted, including physical segregation, obviously, but also a number of mass balance mixed model chain of custody. And with that, I'll hand it back over to you, Josh.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jean-Andre. And if I can ask our speakers to share their cameras. Lovely, thank you. So Jean-Andre, thank you for that presentation. As ever, you've managed to take a topic area that's highly complex and you broke it down so it's understandable, and really stressing this interplay and this link between Scope 3 decarbonisation and chain of custody. And more broadly, I guess, these synergies between corporate responsible sourcing agendas, the use of certification schemes to manage risk and as a means of supporting compliance, and this action on Scope 3 decarbonisation. So we'll have a short discussion. I will look to leave time at least for 1 or 2 questions at the end. I was ambitious in my stacking of content in this presentation, as ever, but hey-ho. So first questions are to you, Anna and Ruth, and it's really just about this controlled mix, this controlled mass balance model that you both shared. So Ruth, you mentioned it's not new. There's examples like the FSC mixed model that's out there already. But for other sectors like soy, this hasn't been seen previously. So I'd be really interested to hear from you both just some of the factors you see as impacting the credibility of this model. What should we be looking out for in controlled mixed or controlled mass balance approaches? And again, if I can ask you to keep your answers brief, and I'll try to do the same with my questions. Over to you, Anna, first.
And maybe I can start with a more sort of general one and then pass over to Anna Laura for specifically for RTRS. But I think what we are learning is that no, we have, as I said, we have some experience. FSC is the obvious one that's had controlled wood for many years, so that there are things we can look at. But there's also been quite a lot of attempts, either by individual companies who've started to put requirements in place, or by sectors. So, for example, in the oil palm sector, the IRF, the implementation reporting framework, is being used by companies to kind of report on the full physical volume together with mass balance certification. So I think what we will need to do as we take this forward is to look at those questions of, no, what are the key characteristics? What kind of data do we need to know that those characteristics are being broadly delivered? And then how do we verify that? And my guess, but also I guess kind of recommendation really is that we try to build from what already exists and move forward in a stepwise way. And where we need to introduce greater rigor or complexity because it's not working, we do so, but we don't start from something which is very complex and try and work backwards.
Yes, and to add to what Ruth was saying, of course, the decision of moving to this system has to do with EUDR in our case, but it's also very much linked, as I was saying in the presentation, with what the market has been asking for a very long time. And we think it's also an interesting solution to put all our strengths together and not stop. Like in the soy sector, there is a lot of competition. There are many different schemes around and available, and we need to be realistic and collaborate, like we've been saying for I don't know how much time. And every time we have a discussion with ICIL, we say the word collaboration. I mean, I think this is a system that will help put all our efforts together with one specific goal. We need to grow in volumes, and we need to respond to a regulation, but also we want to change the way things are at farm level, as I was saying, and I think this is also a very positive solution to address that, right? Putting all our efforts together, and as Ruth was saying, we in our example, or in our case, of course, and again, this is still not yet approved, so we need to test it, hopefully by the beginning of next year. But the idea is to use what the existing certifications way of working and the existing auditing system to work with this new model, right? So to work on the baseline that we already have, and try and see how it works, what it comes out of this, right?
Brilliant, thank you both. And I think some key themes there of building on what's already out there and not trying to overcomplicate from start, because this needs to ultimately be implementable by supply chain organizations as well, right? This isn't just a technical exercise in drafting standards. This is about real implementation and feasibility of implementation. Brilliant, thank you. Jean-Andre, both you and Anna, you both talked about the need for incentives and offering practical solutions to drive sustainable production and to drive decarbonization. So at the same time, the solutions that we need to bring to market need to be credible, and they need to be robust, and we need to have safeguards in place to prevent misuse and abuse. So could you speak a bit to, I guess, how you would see sustainability systems navigating these parallel needs and some of the trends that you see? And I think particularly in the whole book and claim credit trading space, where it's clearly a hot topic currently.
Yes, indeed. There will be a lot to say on that topic, but maybe to create a transition with like the previous question, I think there's, in terms of incentive, I see an opportunity with chain of custody when it comes to trying to bridge responsible sourcing objective and scope-free decarbonization strategies. And it really relates to the ability of a chain of custody system to track different types of environmental attributes. And that can be leveraged to really maximize the return on the investment in traceability that has everything to do with the chain of custody system. But back to your question on the need for, I guess, a consensus between credibility and effective and practical solutions, if I understand correctly the point here. I think, to be honest, every single management chain of custody system, they are designed with this kind of balance in mind. They are offering a practical compromise between robust tracking, because it's reconciliation at every step of a value chain, but it remains adaptable and flexible for businesses. I think that the risk we need to be aware of when we select the most appropriate model is that if we allow for systems that are extremely efficient, playing with all the parameters you introduced earlier, Josh, allocation, attribution, and we have to avoid undermining the push for more transparency and more accountability. Okay, it could be an unintended consequence that we would disincentivize further push for traceability. So we really need to maintain that level of connectedness. I have, but I'm conscious of time, but just a practical example, maybe when we have a management system, a multi-site management system, there are different options of running such a system. And for me, there's really two different scenarios. One, it's a scenario where all sites are actually involved in the sourcing of, the commodity of interest from the sourcing region of interest. And here we have a strong connectedness within the system. But if we allow that same multi-site system to operate with sites that are not connected to the product of interest, of course, we create a disruption in the level of traceability. It's more flexible, but is it credible enough? I think that's the question you're asking.
Brilliant, thank you for that, Jean-Andre. And I think your example there answers some of the questions that we're getting in chat as to why we have distinguished between allocation and attribution within the guidance. Again, it's about not obfuscating, and I guess it's about not over allocating attributes or characteristics to individual products. So we have time, I think, for one question, which I'll put to you all as a group. And that's, I guess, to summarize James Griffith's point about, I guess, the level of appetite or the level of consensus there is around controlled mixed mass balance or controlled mass balance as being an alternative to segregation. So Ana Laura, Ruth, I don't know if you'd like to share a bit just from what you're hearing from stakeholders on this topic.
Ruth,
Yeah,
you can,
sure.
you can
I
start.
can start. I can't talk on behalf of AFI, but AFI, I think we've certainly been working with them closely on looking at a variety of different models. I think they are supportive of a range of models, not only segregation. And I think really for me, what it comes back to, and no, both Ana Laura and Jean-Andre were also kind of implicit in what they were saying, is we need to come back to what impact are we trying to drive, and that's the thing that I think is most important. And if we can study each of them in that context, my sense is that there is quite a lot of certainly at the production end, there is a lot of support for a variety of models. I think in some parts of the consumer market there's been a very efficient drive to say only if it's segregated is it credible. And I think, as I said in my earlier intervention, that's very risky in terms of saying, actually, all we are doing is buying ourselves a sense of being on a moral high ground without actually doing anything about changing things on the ground. And I think if people become aware of that, then there will be a lot of appetite for exploring what is the best way in each sector to actually improve things. Ana Laura, over to you.
Yes, thank you. Well, yeah, definitely. I agree with everything that Ruth was saying. We need to find like like we were all saying, actually, we need to find a solution that is both credible and doable. We never need to forget about the possibility of doing things, the feasibility, right? Otherwise, we would be asking for too much, and that's what we learned during the last years in RTRS, discussing how to address EUDR. And I'm mentioning again and again EUDR because it was what led us to this model, right? We need to find a solution that is doable, that companies can implement, that producers can answer to, and that is also producing and creating a change. Again, we'll see how it will work. But I think with some examples that are out there already, we know it's a possibility, right?
Perfect. Thank you, Ana Laura. Thank you, Ruth, and thank you, Jean-Andre. And apologies for those online, we couldn't get to more of your questions. What I think we'll do is we'll circulate some of the questions via email after this webinar with some answers along with the recording link and the slides as well. So just again, a very big thank you to our speakers, to our audience for this excellent session. I suspect it could have gone on for 3 hours, but we only had an hour, so next time. And thank you again to Walmart Foundation for supporting ICIL's work on chain of custody. Again, you can see on the slide here how you can access and participate in the public consultation. I would thoroughly recommend for everyone to participate. Please help us make this as useful a guidance material as possible. Natalia's posted it in chat. Thank you. And just thank you again. And I wish everyone an excellent rest of the day. And I look forward to seeing all of your input in the consultation. So thank you again and take care.